9 months into the Russia-Ukraine conflict, what challenges lie ahead as winter approaches? Hello, I'm Nathan King, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Hello again. Ukrainians are reeling from nationwide power outages and water shortages after Russian missiles struck key infrastructure. Meanwhile, Moscow has suspended its involvement in the Black Sea UN-brokered grain deal after claims of Ukrainian drone attacks on the Crimean city of Sevastopol. That agreement is up for renewal on November 19th, but the Kremlin insists it will only renew exports after investigation and guarantees from Kiev. We begin tonight with a report from CGTN's Sergio Olmos.
We had a number of outages and restricted water supply. 80% of people were without water yesterday. That has been restored. Full power, full water restoration to the citizens of Kyiv, the capital. This is according to Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor, who said that crews were working yesterday to try to restore power as quickly as they could. It took several hours, more than 4, and they did it on first the left bank, then the right bank. These strikes have really depleted the resources of rescue crews, or rather utility workers, who they say they're running out of supplies to repair these power stations. And the water is becoming a huge issue. Mayor Vitaly Klitschko asking people to stock up on that, because as it gets colder, as the weather gets more brutal, with these strikes, he fears that people will be in dire situations. They're now setting up 1,000 heating points across the city. In the case that power can't be restored quickly, people will be able to gather to those heating points. And we also know that, according to the British Ministry of Defense, Russia will get an influx of more Iranian-supplied drones, including the Shahed 136 drone. The British Ministry of Defense says that they're getting about 200 more. Those have had devastating effects here in Ukraine. We also saw in Kherson, Russian-backed officials have moved out of the city of Kherson, according to the British Ministry of Defense, and moved 100 kilometers south. There also is evacuations occurring on the eastern portion of the Dnipro River. This is the first time that people are being asked to leave their homes there. There had been more than 70,000 civilians evacuated in Kherson itself, but now those evacuations occurring on the eastern portion of the Dnipro River, signifying just how significant this Ukrainian counteroffensive is, that Russian armed forces are pulling civilians back even across the river. They say that Ukraine is planning to blow up the hydroelectric power dam there. Ukraine says that Russia is actually lining it with explosives, that they plan to blow it. In either case, if that dam were to blow, it would have significant, catastrophic rather, effects on the population, environmental impacts. It would pose problems for the Zaporozhie nuclear power plant. And more than 80 settlements would be affected by flooding. This evacuation really signaling how serious this Ukrainian counteroffensive is in the south.
So lots to discuss. Let's bring in our guest. Joining us from London, Marcus Papadopoulos. He's a historian, analyst and author specializing in Russia and the former Soviet Union. From North Carolina, we have Klaus Loss. He is a professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And here in Washington, D.C., friend of the show, Anton Fedyashin, professor of history at American University. And in Texas, we have Sergey Kudelia. He is an associate professor of political science at Baylor University. Welcome, all of you, to the show. Sergey, from where you sit, we heard Sergio's report there on the ground. What's going on in terms of the war as we enter its 9th month? We're seeing potential retreats of Russian forces around the key city of Kherson, but then we're seeing missile offensives in the west, seemingly aimed at infrastructure. Is this tit for tat? Is this a scramble before winter sets in?
Well, it's clearly a new phase in this conflict, where the Russian troops are on the defensive, both in the south and in the eastern parts in Donbass. They have been for months trying to seize the town of Bakhmut in Donbass, and they failed to do so. As you heard, they are evacuating now people even from the eastern bank of Dnieper. And in order to compensate for these problems with their fighting capacity, they are attacking Ukrainian civilians, and they are escalating their attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. political scientists would call it an escalation trap. In other words, in order to intimidate civilian population, they need to increase the intensity of their attacks and of their violence. But by doing so, they're actually damaging their interests, because with every new attack like the one that just was described by your reporter, the resolve of the Ukrainian people is strengthening. And the support that we receive from the West is going up as well. We now know that Americans will be providing us with advanced surface-to-air missiles, something that they have been for months resisting to do. The Germans have been doing the same in response to these attacks on civilian infrastructure by the Russians. So the Russians are actually shooting themselves in the foot by doing these types of attacks, and they're alienating the very people that they hoped at some point would be supporting them when they arrive.
Anton Fedyashin, is that something you agree with, that that's the state of the conflict at the moment?
Yes, it's a stalemate. The Russians are making very limited gains in the Donbass. That's the only part that I slightly disagree with in what Serhiy has said. He's absolutely right that the advance has been glacial, but the Russians are pushing towards Bakhmut, and they're on the outskirts of the city. But it is a very tough fight. But in the north, they have stopped the Ukrainian advance after the Ukrainians very successfully liberated a huge chunk of Kharkov province. And in the south, around Kherson, the rapid Ukrainian offensive has slowed down, but it looks like where everyone's preparing for a major battle, and it's impossible to predict how that will go.
Yeah, let's move on to the other area of the conflict, of course, because we've seen heightened attacks in and around Crimea. Before we go to our next guest, I'd like to play a clip of Vladimir Zelensky, because on the wake of some of these attacks, of course, there has been a suspension or abandonment, whatever you want to call it. We'll see that in real time, of the UN Turkish-brokered grain deal in the Black Sea. Let's listen to President Zelensky pointing the finger at Moscow over this.
Russia is the only one to blame for the fact that food will now become more expensive for people across a vast expanse from West Africa to East Asia. Russia is the reason why people, in particular Ethiopia, Yemen, or Somalia, are left with a catastrophic food shortage.
Serhiy, what's your reaction to that suspension?
Well, this suspension is another sign that the Russians, unfortunately, are fighting in a very dirty manner. Ukrainians targeted a military infrastructure in Crimea. Black Sea Fleet, Russian ships are military targets. It's legitimate for the Ukrainians to target them. So again, rather than fighting a fair war, which Russia initiated, they are trying to put pressure on the civilians, and this will be the civilians who will be suffering from the shortfall of food.
Okay, Marcus, can you pick up off the back of that? Because obviously the view from Moscow is very different. I'm going to just play you Russian President Vladimir Putin ahead of your comments.
So, we're not saying that we are ending our participation in this deal. No. We're saying that we are suspending it. One of the organizers of this deal was the United Nations General Secretary. United Nations representatives take active part in this process, and we are grateful to them, obviously. Then let them communicate with Ukraine so that there are guarantees from Ukraine that there will be no risks for civil ships and Russian ships, which provide security.
Marcus?
Can I say, first of all, that ever since Russia began partial mobilization and began attacking the energy infrastructure of Ukraine, there have been no further Russian tactical retreats, either in the Donbass, in Kharkov or Zaporozhie or in Kherson. Indeed, the Ukrainian counteroffensives in Zaporozhie and Kherson have been completely halted. And as a result, the Ukrainian armed forces have lost thousands of men. Now, turning to the grain deal, it is very clear that Russia has not terminated its participation in the agreement. Rather, Moscow has suspended its involvement in the grain deal. And the reason for that, according to the Kremlin, is that the Ukrainian government is using the humanitarian corridor from Odessa as a cover to attack the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Navy based in Sevastopol. Now, that is a very serious allegation, and it must be heard at the United Nations Security Council. After all, what is the United Nations Security Council for if such allegations are not to be heard? The problem is that the Western powers are blocking a discussion from taking place, which I find very telling and very suspicious.
Klaus, I'd like to bring you in. You've done, obviously studied a lot of interactions between European powers. You know, Europe is obviously looking at this. They'd hoped that the silver lining of the grain deal would lead to perhaps a reduction in tensions. We haven't seen that. There are also discussions about moving some sort of discussions forward. All this seems to be a bit moot at the moment, as obviously Moscow and Kiev very much on a war footing. Is that how you feel?
Well, the grain deal obviously is very important, and discussions are going on in Istanbul, and hopefully it can be restored. But the whole episode and what we heard from my colleagues here just a few minutes ago indicates that Russia cannot really win this war anymore. You know, the Russians wanted to be in Kiev, they wanted to conquer most of Ukraine. Instead of that, they are really even pushed back by the Ukrainians in the east and the south of the country. Even if that offensive by the Ukrainians is not continuing as successful as it was a few weeks ago. But the only way Russia has to win this war is by really exhausting the Ukrainian population. That is the reason why we see attacks on the civilian population, on the infrastructure of Ukraine, on power plants and water supply, and by dividing the Western allies. You know, if the Europeans were struggling and battling with each other and were not agreeing on a united front of how to confront Russia in this war, and if the United States changed its mind and did not deliver as much ammunition and weapons and anti-missile systems to Ukraine, then of course Russia would stand a chance to win this war. But as it is impossible for Russia to win the war because the transatlantic allies so far are quite united. And I think despite the energy crisis, despite rising inflation and other problems, domestic problems in Europe and the United States, I cannot see a breach among the transatlantic allies.
Well, let me press you on that. I'll follow up with you, Klaus, because you know we saw a meeting in the last few days between Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, and President Emmanuel Macron, and even though they said it was a great discussion, we know there is deep divisions in terms of energy security policy, engaging with Moscow going forward to try and work out some sort of ceasefire, and engagement just across the board. Do you think this veneer, and I'm going to say veneer as a sort of editorial because you never know how deep a veneer is, of unity can last a winter where obviously it's fingers crossed in terms of energy supplies and prices?
It is, of course, difficult to say, but I would predict that it will hold, because the energy crisis this winter will not be as bad as expected. 92%, some say even 97% of all the storage centers in Europe are full with gas. And the winter may be quite a warm, quite a mild winter, at least at the moment. You know, winter hasn't really started in Europe or in the United States and on the East Coast. So that promises that that the energy crisis during this winter will not be as severe as expected. That also means that struggles of the Europeans to keep their houses warm and the light on in their sitting rooms and bedrooms, that will be less difficult than predicted. And it also means that the Europeans probably will keep united, will stay united, and will not allow themselves to be divided by the escalating crisis.
Marcus, I just want you to pick up quickly on that. Is Moscow getting it wrong when it thinks it can test the unity of the European powers?
To argue that Europe is unified in its economic crusade against Russia is not just a myth, it is a grotesque lie. Yes, in public, Europe is unified. In private, Europe is bitterly divided. German, French, And Italian industrialists, for example, have grave reservations about their respective countries being involved in an economic war against Russia. And they are making those grave reservations very clear to policymakers in Rome, Berlin, and Paris. There are other countries in Europe which also have grave reservations, such as the Czech Republic, Greece, Bulgaria, and also Hungary. Furthermore, the Japanese government recently said that it will not downscale its trade relationship with Russia any further, because otherwise this could have dire consequences for the Japanese economy. After all, Japan is heavily reliant on Russian oil.
So, you want to come in here?
Yes, well, first of all, I think what matters is certainly the public position of these officials. I agree that there are many conversations in private that raise doubts about the sanctions and the current sanction regime. But the public position of all the officials, and there are no serious high-ranking officials who spoke openly against it in the European Union, is certainly that Ukraine will receive support for as long as it takes. And there have been serious commitments made just recently in Germany during the big conference, donors conference, regarding the economic support that Ukraine will be receiving through the winter.
And do you think that will, sorry to interrupt, but just to move it forward, do you think that will last the winter and going forward?
It will certainly last winter. And what I want to emphasize here is that, as I mentioned earlier, Russia is in escalation trap. They are making outrageous attacks on the civilian infrastructure, which will only get worse. And by doing this, they are damaging this possibility of lifting sanctions, because every new attack like this, where people are left without electricity or water, causes outrage within the European societies and prevents European officials from lifting any sanctions or cooperating with Moscow.
Okay, Anton, I want to get your reaction to, I wouldn't call it a split, but there's definitely been some reporting and some leaking here in Washington, D.C. about President Biden having fiery phone calls with Volodymyr Zelensky after the U.S. had given them $1 billion worth of weapons. There was apparently a list saying, can we have this as well? And Biden got upset. Let's face it, with the midterm elections coming up, Ukraine may not be top of the ballot, but there are growing rumblings across the U.S. As this conflict continues about how much money is being supplied, and they're going to need more money probably before the end of the year, and it's already been tens of billions. Should we read anything into this, considering the public statements that Marcus and others were talking about? It can be very different in private.
I wouldn't read too much into the alleged spat between President Biden and Zelensky. First of all, it happened over the summer, and not much has changed in the American position on its support for Ukraine. I expect it will continue. Now, what we are seeing is growing public statements that go against the sanctions against Russia. By the way, it's also happening in Europe, and Viktor Orban has been one of the most vocal, publicly vocal critics of this. And we also had the example of the 30 congressmen from the Democratic Party, by the way, submitting a letter, then retracting.
Can we bring that up on the screen, guys? Because I was going to mention that next, Anton, but you preempted my next question. But yeah, people can read it for themselves. But essentially, this is a letter, as you were just starting to say, basically urging potential negotiations towards some sort of ceasefire going forward. It was withdrawn. There's been a huge amount of media criticism as well, hasn't there, Anton? You can take it from there. Sorry, I stole your thunder.
Of course. There has been, understandably so, because there's still an enormous amount of support politically for Ukraine, especially here on Capitol Hill. But the fact that this letter appeared to begin with is already a sign that things are changing. Now, is this going to be a strategic game changer for the war in Ukraine? I seriously doubt it. But the fact that American politicians are beginning to ask themselves the question about, their own political future versus support for Ukraine is already becoming evident in the run-up to the midterm elections, which incidentally are exactly 1 week ahead of us. In Europe, we've already seen several governments come and go, and although no one admits it openly, although it wasn't around the issue of the war in Ukraine specifically, it was around the issue of the economic war launched against Russia. And regardless of how we feel about whether that's justified or not, it is having very serious economic consequences for Europe. And let me just quickly respond to something that Klaus said earlier. We've heard a lot of talk, and there's been a lot of writing about, you know, the gas reserves being at more than 90% capacity, which is full. But let me just remind everyone that the gas reserves that were created in Europe were not created to supply Europe with gas throughout the winter season. No. They were created by the gas companies to step in case of accidents or unforeseen situations. And so the gas would be temporarily released while the problems were solved. This is by no means a cushion that will last Europe through the winter. Moreover, it is going to be a tough winter, as every sane economist from all over Europe has admitted. And what's even worse is that after the winter's over, there's no gas coming to Europe in increased amounts to compensate for the Russian gas, which has been a large part, not the whole story, but a large part of the European economic miracle for over the past 40 years. So after the winter's over, there's still going to be a spring and a summer when European industry is going to have to deal with astronomical energy prices.
Well, I'm going to go to Klaus in a minute, but I want to bring back in Marcus, because this talk of ceasefire, negotiation from some elements of the US political establishment has been interesting. And, you know, a friend was pointing out to me today that there is already an agreement on the table that never got implemented, which was, of course, the Minsk agreements, Minsk I, Minsk II. And there seems to be, I wouldn't say growing, but definitely some sort of opinion here in the US, and it may have something to do with the midterms, that this war has to end at some point. And what do you think Moscow would accept? Would it go back to Minsk I and II?
No, I don't. Whilst I personally would like to see the war in Ukraine ended diplomatically, the reality is that the outcome will be decided on the battlefield. Russia has the manpower, the weaponry, the defense industry, and the unity of its people to bring about a victory. And Russia has been winning this war ever since the 24th of February, and Russia will emerge victorious. Vast amounts of Russian soldiery are arriving in Belorussia, have arrived in Kherson, have arrived in Zaporozhie, and have arrived in Donetsk and Lugansk. Now that the Ukrainian counteroffensive has been brought to a brutal halt in Kherson and Zaporozhie, at some stage soon, the Russian army will launch a massive counteroffensive in the south. Furthermore, the Russian forces are, in my opinion, gathering strength in Belorussia to invade Ukraine from the north and to advance to the Ukrainian-Polish border to take control of that, which would end the Ukrainian army's supplies of weaponry from NATO. So whilst the war is not going to end imminently, nonetheless, we will see the next stage in the Russian military campaign. And to those people who are condemning Russia for attacking the energy infrastructure of Ukraine, I say this: where were you when NATO was destroying the energy infrastructure of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia?
Okay, yeah, that's going back a bit, and I understand your point. But we've got Klaus shaking his head here, so I'm going to bring in Klaus, but I was going to go to Sergei, so I'll get him afterwards. Klaus.
Thank you. With all respect, this is pure Russian propaganda. Putin himself
could have it. Propaganda, because I have a different opinion to you.
Yeah, I think we should avoid the propaganda labels and let people speak from their own positions. Klaus, if you've got a good counterpoint, Klaus.
Why don't you engage?
Marcus, let Klaus, just speak from your point of view. Thanks.
Yes, Putin himself couldn't have expressed it any better. We know very well that the Russian troops have a lack of equipment, have a lack of will to fight. The mobilization of the Russian army has led to new conscripts who are not experienced, who have to bring their own equipment, and that is equipment which is very poor. They are not a good fighting force at all. So that Russia has been winning this war since February is a lot of, really with respect, it's a lot of nonsense. Russia is on the defensive. It is clearly being pushed back. How long it will take for Russia to lose this war, we don't know, of course. But at the moment, it is not looking very good for Russia at all. We should realistically accept that and admit that. Regarding the energy situation in Europe, I think I would be slightly more optimistic that the winter will be survived by all Western governments, and that unity will not shatter because of the energy or inflation situation. Of course, what will happen in the spring, we don't know.
Okay, Sergei, I want to bring you in here because you've got a lot to react to. First of all, the strategic situation and whether there could ever be a negotiated settlement that saw some sort of autonomy for the Donbass regions, Crimea potentially just becoming part of Russia with security guarantees going forward for Kiev, or do you think that's a goner and it has to be won on the battlefield by either side?
Well, Donbass autonomy is impossible because we already know that Putin sees Donbass as part of Russia, not just Donbass, but also other oblasts in Ukraine like Kherson and Zaporozhie. He just called them parts of Russia. So this is not possible. But to our colleague in London, I want to say one thing. You need to listen more closely to the commander of the Russian forces, Surovikin, who admitted publicly that Russian forces are actually facing a very tough fight with the Ukrainians and that he would have to make very difficult decisions. And by difficult decisions, most of the analysts understood the need to evacuate Russian troops from Kherson and other parts of southern Ukraine, which would be very difficult for the Russians to control without access through the bridges. The bridges have been destroyed over the Dnieper River. As a result, the Russians would have to evacuate their troops. So certainly Russians are on the defensive and they are retreating.
And in terms of the Allied situation, Sergei, I'm going to give you the last word, Sergei, because you've been very patient. In terms of the unity of the US and Kiev and the European allies, do you think there'll be more of a push for peace because of the length of the war and, let's face it, the increasing cost for their own citizens?
The West would not be able to affect the position of Ukraine on the peace talks. Ukraine would not accept, as was publicly stated, any peace talks without prior withdrawal of the Russian troops from the Ukrainian territory. So I do not think this is a realistic proposition at this point.
Well, I really appreciate everyone's candidness here. Very different opinions. Sergei, of course, Marcus in London, Klaus as well, and of course Anton here in Washington, D.C. Always a lively discussion. Thanks. We need to leave it there. I'm Nathan King, Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching another edition of The Heat. I'll see you tomorrow.